G'day guys, Tom Craig here. Welcome to my podcast, The Help Side. Now the help side is a term in hockey that refers to the other side of the pitch, away from where the ball is and the action happens. And in the same way, the aim of this podcast is to give you, the listener, an insight into the other side of elite hockey players, to hear about their highs, their lows, and what makes them tick. We'll also hear about the journey they went through, from having fun in the backyard to playing out their dreams on the world stage. So whether you're a player, a coach, an umpire, a parent, a fan, or just a fan of sport in general, I'm hoping this podcast gives you a window into the world of elite athletes, and even better, encourages you to get more involved in our great sport. You can hear the chat we had last week and others you may have missed by searching The Help Side on any major podcast platform. And if you want, you can like and subscribe our page to make sure that you're up to date with the most recent episodes. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's get to this week's guest. For fans of Hockey Down Under, Ashley Morrison could reasonably be considered the voice of hockey. With 32 years in media across 37 countries, Ashley is the world's premier hockey broadcaster with a level of insight and attention to detail that is second to none. He's a commentator, a journalist, a writer, an award-winning documentary maker, and as anyone that knows him will tell you, a fierce ambassador for sports like hockey that maybe don't get the recognition in the mainstream media that they deserve. Indeed, his podcast, Not the Footy Show, covers over 78 sports, most of which typically lack the coverage in popular forums. Ashley is a man with a passion for both the history and the human side of sport, and in this podcast, we talk about his journey as a sports journalist, a path that has taken him to all corners of the globe, and we tackle some of the big issues facing hockey as a sport. From TV coverage in the Pro League, to the domestic and international calendar, through to grassroots hockey and the current state of the game, Ashley holds considered and compelling opinions that he shares with us over the next hour or so. You'll find Ash to be, above all, your quintessential sports fan, and it's fitting that he's made his career expertly sharing the very thing he loves most about sport, the people and their stories. If, like me, you care about the future of our sport, you're going to enjoy this one. This is the help side of Ashley Morrison. Here we go. I'm here with Ashley Morrison, the voice of hockey, you could say, in Australia. Ashley, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to join you.
No problem. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm excited. I think last time I spoke to you on a similar situation, I was just about to debut and I was sitting in my house in Sydney and you were interviewing me. So the tables have turned.
It's not very often I'm the interviewee, but so it's new ground for me too.
Well, I've never interviewed a journalist, so let's see how we go. To start off, you're not just a journalist. You're a sports commentator, a journalist, as we mentioned, a documentary maker, a writer, and you've got your own podcast, which is what I featured on a long, long time ago, called Not the Footy Show. What else do you do? Is there anything you can't do? You're obviously a massive advocate of sport, but where do you get your pleasure from with all that stuff?
Oh, look, I just, as I say, I played a lot of sport when I was younger. I've always kind of loved it, had ambitions to make it as a cricketer, but soon found at a certain stage that I wasn't good enough to make it to the top level. And then obviously followed a career path, which was interesting. I worked in newspapers initially in the UK, then came to Australia, worked in magazines, radio, and then, progressed into television. So it's kind of the media thing had always been there, but it was always secondary to my full-time job. Or certainly at some stages it was secondary. When it was radio, I'd work on that at the weekends and have a full-time job during the week. But yeah, sport's always been something I love. I like the stories behind it, the unpredictability of it, and that in a game, a story will unfold in front of your eyes. And I think I just love stories. I love sports, so the two just kind of mold together, and that's the enjoyment I get from it.
Yeah, sure. I can see there's a lot of cricket memorabilia around the study where you're sitting for this interview. What was the transition into hockey like? I mean, did you consider pursuing cricket from a journalism perspective, or you still do that, or?
Oh, look, cricket's really hard. I mean, I've only ever, I think, been involved in commentating cricket twice, and that was at the 2003 Cricket World Cup in South Africa. I did a couple of games there. But I would love to get into cricket because that was what I really was my passion as a child. But hockey was funny because I wouldn't say I was I was a dirty player. I don't think I was a good player. But I sort of, the school I first was at, when we when I left to go to the next school, I said, "Oh, thank you. I don't have to play hockey anymore. I can play football." And then they went, "But the school you're going to is like famous for its hockey." And I was like, "Oh, hell, I didn't realize that." So I ended up playing, and it was funny. I had two coaches who, you talk about people that have an influence on your life. I had, one coach who just knew how to get the best out of me, and that he would rile me up in the change rooms before the game. I'd go out there, have a hell of a game, and soon I sussed out what he was doing. But I was enjoying it so much by then that it was, and so I actually carried on playing after I left school. But then, work got in the way, and so I stopped playing. As for how I got into it with the commentary, through Not the Footy Show, funnily enough, because the whole premise of the show was about covering all the sports that were not AFL, because there's some great stories, great athletes, and they don't get the publicity. So we were a show that was going to be all about other sports, give them their 5 minutes every week, or 10 minutes was usually what we sort of used to allocate, and make it, the other sports, the heroes. And suddenly a friend of mine up in Asia called Jason Dacey rang me, goes, "Can you commentate hockey?" And I went, "Yeah, I think I can." And it was actually for the World Series hockey, which, came before the Hockey India League. And so they, Neo Sports contacted me and said, "Can you do this?" And so I went up there and had an absolute ball, really enjoyed it. Worked with Michael Absalom, Godfrey Phillips, Debayan Sen, and Shez Haq from Singapore. And, we did that tournament. And I think there were a lot of things in that were really good and really innovative. But that was really how it started. I'd actually done a Hockey Roos game with Mark Hagar here in Perth. We did it on the radio when China came down, and we did 2 of the test matches. So that was probably the first time I commentated the hockey, and then obviously the World Series in India.
Yeah, right. That's actually reasonably recently, and I guess India is a happening place for a lot of hockey. I was interested in how you get into hockey, because it's not really a mainstream sport, I guess. But when it comes to commentating hockey, you kind of have to blaze a trail of your own, because it's not super well coveraged. Are there any role models you kind of looked up to, or how did you model your hockey commentary?
I don't think I kind of modeled it on anybody, to be honest. I've sort of found that when you do various sports, so just to sort of move away from the hockey, I did the Kabaddi World Cup, and you've been in India and you've seen the Kabaddi. And that was really difficult. And when we had a sort of trial run, when the teams were having their warm-ups, I was a disaster. And the sort of director was like, "Oh my God, what have I done? I've hired this guy." And I said, "Now, look, just let me go and sit in the stands, and in my head, just go through it on my own." And I said, "Tomorrow when we come back, I'll be fine." So it's I think working out how you're going to do it, the pace and whatever. So I actually owe a lot, to be honest, to a guy called Narendra Pal Singh in Star Sports in India, because I'd done the first Hockey India League and then went up, and he'd taken over pretty much running the Hockey India League, and he'd, from a broadcast point of view, and he sort of said, "Look, we want to make it more exciting. We want to get that energy. It's a fast-paced game." He absolutely loves his hockey. And so we had about 3 or 4 days, I think, in a workshop. And, he was sort of saying, "Can you make it more exciting?" So I actually changed the way I was doing it, if you listen to the stuff sort of pre that time, and tried to give them exactly what they were asking for. And the feedback I got was that this was really good. People liked it. And to be honest, I felt it sounded better when I was actually doing it. So I owe everything really to him. If he wasn't a role model, but he was, I suppose, a guide or a mentor that said, "Can you do this? This is what we want."
Sure. And you're very well researched. I think that's something that comes across well in your commentary. I mean, people who watch us often say, like, "I'm glad that Ash is commentating, because he's fantastic and he knows the players and he knows a lot about the game." But obviously there was a long period there where you're away from the game. Hockey wasn't front and center for you. And it's not like with the top players and with all the players you've got to commentate, there's a wealth of information that is easily accessible like there are with other sports. How are you so well researched?
I spend a lot of time on that. I mean, my basic principle on a lot of things is, for every hour you're on air, try and do 2 hours prep.
Sure.
But then beyond that, I do a lot more than that. So again, I'll watch all the tournaments. I'll keep notes if something happens, or a certain player, event happens with them. And I've kind of now built up files on all the players that are currently playing. Some of them are very hard to find information. When you do something like the Sultan of Johor Cup, when they're an under-21 side, trying to find information on some of these guys is really, really difficult. But I just think to me, it's very important. As I said, I had ambitions to play professional cricket, didn't make it, but I therefore admire all you guys and the dedication you have. And I know what it takes to get to the top. So it's kind of my tribute to you guys, is paying respect to you. Is the least I can do is find out about you and promote you and away from the sport as well, and say, look, Tom Craig is not just a hockey player, he's studying law and he's a smart guy.
No, we certainly appreciate it. But the thing as well about hockey is that you've got to cover across both the men's and the women's games. At times, you can't just focus in on the men's game or the women's game. And often you have to do that on the same day. Not only that, but you might have to do 5-6 games going back and forth between men's and women's, which is just mental. Can you walk us through a little bit about how hectic that is and how you make sure that you're prepared for something like that?
I think the most I've ever done is 4 in a day,
okay.
Which that is hard. I think the biggest thing that it's hard is on your voice. And Martin Tyler, the famous football commentator, I remember seeing him interviewed many years ago, and he said, you just have to learn to pace yourself. So he goes, the first game, you cannot get too excited in it. And you can build during the day that your excitement levels so that you look after your voice. So that was actually a really good bit of advice. So if anyone watches, they'll probably find I'm not quite as high tempo in the first game as I may be in the last game. But that's more about looking after your voice. As for sort of the research, yes, it's a lot of work. And what I tend to do is I have a very strict routine, just as you players would. And I think sometimes having played sport and having had that discipline when you're preparing for a match as an athlete, I've sort of brought that into my broadcast world. So everyone that knows me will know I get up in the morning, I will have my breakfast, then I go back to my room, and I will then for the next 2-3 hours be doing the notes for the games on that day. And I follow the same routine every single tournament, wherever I am in the world. And that's just, I then am confident that I've got everything that I need for those games. And I've done it the way I've done it every single time. You could say I'm a bit OCD with it, but I think it's just, to me, it's that preparation and doing it the way you've always done it, so you're confident that if something goes wrong, you've got it.
Sure. And with hockey, we're not the most well-resourced sport, and sometimes that means you're doing it all by yourself, which I imagine is difficult as well. Obviously, with other sports, there's a whole raft there's a big commentating team, there's a discussion panel, there's a sideline commentator, there's an expert commentator, all these sorts of things. And you've kind of got to roll all of that into one. How do you focus on that? And do you wish you had a little bit more help?
Oh, look, it would be really good. And I mean, I think the sad thing is hockey hasn't been a great sport at keeping records. Patrick Rowley, who is an old journalist from the UK, he apparently has fantastic records going back. Well, he attended the 1948 Olympic Games. So I don't know whether they go back that far, but certainly they're going back to the 50s. And he has offered to sell them to various people because he's going, hang on, this is my life's work. He's now, I presume, in his 70s or 80s. I'm not sure. I might be doing him a disservice there. But he has fantastic records. And occasionally, if there's something come up, I'll ask him. There's also a gentleman in India whose name's just slipped my mind, BG Joshi, who again has fantastic records. And if I'm not sure about a stat or something, I might email them and say, hey, look, is this true? Have I got this right? And they're really good in sharing that information with that. But I can tell you a funny story in that I was doing one tournament. I won't tell you where it was. And they decided to employ statisticians to do all the stuff. And the guy gave me this little 4 pages on the tournament where we were at. And I looked at it and I just threw it straight in the bin. And he was really upset. And he goes, what are you doing? You haven't even looked at it. I said, well, I'm sorry, but if on the front page you haven't even got the top score in the tournament correct, I said, I'm not going to read anything else, because I said, you've lost my trust in you and the job you're doing. I said, I'd rather trust my own statistics that I do on every tournament. And I said, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to. And he was really upset. But again, it's like you're going on air. You've got to trust that the information you're being given is correct.
Mm.
And sometimes it isn't.
Mm.
And therefore, in that case, there was no way I was going to trust what he'd done if he couldn't even get top score. Is a pretty easy thing to get right.
Very true. We're going to go back to something that you said before about the why of your journalism, and I think anyone who's read your work or seen your work will have picked up that you love the story of sport. I mean, you mentioned it before, but you're a storyteller naturally. What is it specifically about the storytelling of sport that has kept you in the journalism game for so long?
That's a really hard question. I mean, I think, growing up, I read books on sport, and you can probably see behind me, I've got, a library of 1,500 books on various sports. So I really enjoy hearing the story behind the athlete and things that they've overcome, etc. So I just think it's those sort of things, and whether you can relate to them or whether they inspire you. And there are some amazing people out there and you look at it, for example, the documentary I just made called Mark Our Place, it's about 3 rugby players who all played for the same club, all went on and played internationally for Ireland, and then all went on to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, the documentary there we were exploring, was it the schooling that they had, so their upbringing, that made them into 3 men that were heroic enough to be awarded the Victoria Cross and be top athletes? Or was it, rugby union, or was it Wanderers Rugby Club, or football club as it's called, in Dublin? Because that's pretty strange. And you sort of think, for something unique like that to happen, what was it? Or was it just a freakish situation? So I just find things like that really fascinating, and they sort of spark my mind, and I get thinking about things, and I just love that. So
that's fantastic. And there's a couple of books, hockey specific books that you've written. There's one that's just been released, I believe, which is about the Wesleyan South Perth Hockey Club in Perth, which is a history of the club. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. That proved to be actually a much bigger task than I'd anticipated. I was asked to do it by one of their life members, Kay Lee, who was a former president of the club. And the reason it proved difficult was it's 3 clubs that merged into one. So you had South Perth Women's Hockey Club, South Perth Men's Hockey Club, and then Old Wesley Hockey Club. And some of them had better record keeping than others. And so I've been sort of trawling through old newspapers, old hockey bulletins, trying to find information. And yeah, it was just really difficult to find some of the earlier stuff. The amazing thing with that, and the part that I've probably enjoyed the most, is I've done 75 interviews for the book. The youngest person was 23, and there were 2 people that were 94. Wow. And sitting with those 2 94-year-olds and hearing their memories of playing in the late 40s, early 50s was just incredible.
That is awesome. That is awesome. And there's another book that you actually gifted me just before the Rio campaign. It's called Australia's Hockey Grail. It's about the Australian men's hockey team and their Olympic journeys. It is the Olympic season now. It's an extended Olympic season, but we are in the Olympic season. And the thing that struck me about this book is that there's you spoke about interviews before and how many interviews you did for the Wesleyan South Perth, but there are a lot of interviews in this one. And I imagine there was a whole bunch of work that went into this. What is it that attracted you about the Australian men's hockey story for the Olympics, firstly? And how did you get all these people to talk to you?
Yeah, that was, again, it was the Hockey India League. I was up there, and we happened to be in Ranchi, and I'd done an interview for Not the Footy Show with Barry Dancer, and we were leading up to, I think, the Olympics then, and he made a comment that you've got to be lucky to win a gold medal. And I thought, lucky? Sure, you need an element of that. But I just it was a comment that it really stuck with me, and I sort of let it ride. And then happened to be talking to the German player Florian Fuchs, and he said, in London, he goes, we were really lucky. We didn't deserve to win the gold medal, but luck was on our side, and that's why we won it. So suddenly I thought, hang on a sec. Everyone's saying that there's this luck element. And then when you analysed it and you looked at it, and yes, you do. You need the odd decision to go your way. You need, no injuries. You need the run of the ball occasionally, when it hits the post to go in rather than come back out. And so then when I looked at it, I thought, yeah, that's interesting. But then there was another conversation in amongst those with Mark Knowles, you're the former captain of the Kookaburras. And it was while we were at the Hockey India League, I think it was the Australian Olympic Committee had come out and said, we're going to win X amount of medals at the Rio Olympic Games. And these are the sports that we'll be winning gold in. These are the sports we'll be winning silver in. And hockey was thrown in as winning a gold medal. And I said to Mark, I said, can you believe that they've come out and said this? And he goes, Mark, he goes, yeah, we're used to it. They do it every 4 years. He goes, it's just, water off a duck's back. And I thought, but where has this expectation come from? Why is it that every 4 years, the media and everybody jumps on the bandwagon with the Kookaburras and goes, they're going to win us gold? And it puts immense pressure on all of you. And because suddenly, when nobody's really given you any focus for 3 years, suddenly everyone's on your back going, oh, we're interested in you now. And also we expect you to win gold. And I just thought, when did this start? And that was really the two things to look at when this expectation started and maybe why Australia's only won the one gold medal.
Is that what you attribute to, you reckon?
I think having, written the book and spoken to so many people with it, I think there's a lot of contributing factors. I think, as everybody says, when you go and you would know this, when you go to a hockey tournament, everybody's there. Usually there's a couple of teams in the same hotel and you're focused on that one sport and you can do, you know that the bus is coming and it's going to take you straight to the stadium. When you go to the Olympics or whatever, as everybody says, it's completely different. There's so many more distractions. There's so many more athletes. And it takes longer to get to the stadium because you've got to go through all security checks, etc. So suddenly your sort of preparation or your day experience is very, very different to what it would be at a normal. And certainly I think some athletes get overawed with it all. And there's a great story in the book with Rob Hammond, how in Athens, he said to Barry Dancer, he goes, oh, the 100 meters finals on, do you mind if I go and play? Go and watch it. And, he said it was probably about an hour to the stadium and an hour back, and for an event that's going to last 10 seconds. And Barry Dancer said, hey, you can go. But he goes, I just want you to remember why you're here. And he said, Rob said, this was a huge thing because he said, I suddenly remembered that I wasn't there to watch events. I was there to play, to perform, to win a gold for Australia. And I think that, again, was brilliant psychology from Barry Dancer because he said, yeah, you can go, but remember why you're here. And I'm sure he would have made a mental note if Rob Hammond had gone, whereas, of course, he chose not to go. And Australia won the gold. Whether that was the reason they won the gold, who knows? But, I just think there's different pressures. And so and it's how players approach it. And I've spoken to other athletes from other sports, and I spoke to one of the gymnasts. I won't embarrass them by saying who it was. And what they said when they got to the Olympics, they could not believe the food hall there. And they suddenly put on, I think it was 2 kilos within the first couple of days. From that point on, the coach had to go to the meals with them to make sure that they didn't eat more than they were meant to.
Yeah, sure. Now, you focused on a lot of teams in this book. I just want to stay on it for a little bit. You probably know a lot more about the different teams that have gone to the Olympics, the Australian men's hockey teams, than anyone else in the world, I would say. Is there a tangible culture difference? Could you get a feel of the culture of each team as it rode up to the Olympics and how each team sort of felt? And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how the team culture's changed over the years, and are there any teams that really stood out to you?
It's really difficult. I don't know if I do know more than anyone else. I think the likes of Rick Charlesworth and Terry Welsh, their memories having been there and as coaches and players are far greater than mine, and they've been in amongst it. So I would never profess that knowledge. But yeah, I think the early guys, the interesting thing was, if you looked at the early teams, there seemed to be a real camaraderie there, that they all were mates. They all had a bit of a laugh, but it was very serious when you went on the pitch. And I think that now, obviously, with, we call the sport professional, but as you will vouch, you don't get paid a lot of money to play it. So calling it professional is stretching it a little bit. But I think now, though, that the environment that you're in is so much more professional, that maybe you don't have that sort of downtime or are allowed the sort of releases that they were allowed in those earlier days. And I just think it's kind of evolved. And if you look, and maybe it needs to have a little bit more of that. Maybe you need that sort of pressure valve released so that you can then go out and actually enjoy it when you get on the pitch. I don't know, but I think there was definitely, if you saw probably in the 90s to the 2000s, the definite shift. Was that to do with, the AIS opening up in the late 80s or sort of, in the 80s? Very much it would probably had a massive impact in that the way people looked towards the game, the way they prepared for the game, became more professional. Sports scientists were involved, sports psychologists. So I think that was probably the time when you saw a major shift.
Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously, you mentioned the AIS, which started, I think, in 1984. Is that right? In Perth?
I'm trying to remember the date. Yeah, I mean, it was after, obviously, the Montreal Olympics when, Australia didn't win a single gold medal. And so then it was decided. And the thing I find quite ironic is that it was modelled on the East German program, which, of course, we now know was full of drug taking and all sorts of things that shouldn't have happened in sport.
Just on that, so it's a controversial topic here in Australia. I mean, we're very lucky that we can have a centralised program. Obviously, the tyranny of distance is something that a lot of countries don't have to deal with. I mean, the European clubs, they all have very strong club structures and they're able to travel for training camps and these sorts of things. But Australia is a very different story. I'd be interested in hearing your opinion on whether the centralised program is a good thing for the sport in Australia.
Again, I don't know if it's fair for me to say because I've not been a part of it, so I don't really know. As a fan of sport, I look at it and I think, why change something that's actually working? Like, it's been incredibly successful if you look at the hockey programs. So why change it? I think, like everything, and I did on my podcast an interview with Ron Smith, who was heading up the AIS football program. And of course, now the likes of Viduka and that are saying they want to bring that back. I think you have to look at it and say, things have changed. The world has evolved. Social media has changed things. You are very different, say, to a Jamie Dwyer when he moved to Perth. And so the things that Jamie would have wanted then and what you guys want now are very different. So I think it has to evolve a little bit. I think there maybe has to be a bit more give and take. One of the things that I've noticed talking to players, both male and female, is maybe Hockey Australia have got to find a way where they can have a program where you guys can go home more than you do. And let's be honest, some people need that familial trip home more than other players. Some are quite happy to be the other side of the country and not having mum telling them they're going to make the bed every day, But I think so. If you look at this is my view. If you look at all the travel that you guys do and the amount of money you're paying for that, surely you could go to an airline and say, look, we're going to be spending X amount of money with you. Can we have 10 tickets across Australia to help our players go home an extra time once a year? Now, or can we have a discounted fare that, maybe you're paying 50% instead of the full fare? Now, I would think, having worked in the airline industry, that could be achieved when you're sitting down putting together a package for your travel for a whole year or for 2 years or whatever. And I do think that needs to be taken into account or taken into consideration. And I think you've got to almost look at it on a person-to-person basis, as I say, because some people really struggle being away from home, whereas others, it doesn't really affect them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we had Rachel Lynch on the show last week. You wouldn't have seen the episode, but she mentioned about often players move to Perth very young. Especially in the women's program, sometimes it's 16, 17, you're uprooting from your family and moving over to Perth. And in the men's, it's typically a little bit later, probably maybe 18, 19, 20 sort of thing. But it is an early move. Do you think that's the best model, or do you think there should be a little bit more time back home in the eastern states?
Again, I think you have to take that on a case-by-case basis. I don't think you can go, we're not taking anybody at 16. I think you've got to look at each individual and are they ready for it? Do they want to do it? Is there the option for them to go home if they're not happy? You've got to take all those things. I think there's almost like the duty of care in loco parente. Certainly if, they are 16, then Hockey Australia or the AIS have to take, it's no longer the AIS, is it now? So it's Hockey Australia that run the performance program. So, they have to take that responsibility for the welfare of those young players. And to me, that's, something that they need to take very seriously. I think you have to look again is, do we want, and if you go back to what the AIS was when it was set up, it was the development players originally. So the top players stayed in their states, played for their clubs in Brisbane, in New South Wales, etc. And they came together for a camp before they went off to the tournament. And it was the young players that they were looking to get to that level that came over. So it was almost like the AIS was a finishing school for those players who'd been identified with talent, and then they were allowed to go back. So I think there needs to be as well maybe an onus on some of the clubs, and that's the interesting thing, having written the book on Wasps, was a lot of the international players that had come across to Perth had said how welcome they'd felt at Wasps and how the club had really made them feel that they had a support network there. Now, speaking to some of those players who played at other clubs, they said, I didn't get that at X club, but when I got to Wasps, it was unbelievable, and I was just embraced, and I always felt that there were people there to support me. And I mean, you would know, moving into state, it's tough. You need people around you that you can ring up and say, hey, look, I'm feeling a bit down, do you want a coffee? Or you just want company, or all of those things. And you need something away from that high performance group, that it may still be a hockey group, but it's not that high performance where you're so focused. You need something where you can go and have a bit of a laugh, and it's a different atmosphere.
Yeah, sure. So for context, the way it works in the Hockey Australia and Hockey WA partnership, I guess, is that often there's a raft of players coming over from the eastern states, move to Perth to take up the scholarship, and there's a draft system whereby players get fed into different clubs, and it is a draft, isn't it? It's a snake system or whatever. But obviously the difficulty is that they're not there to play hockey for the club per se. They're there to play for Australia. But it does mean that they have to play for the club when it's possible. Now, it's an interesting situation in Perth. I mean, you would know a fair bit about it, having researched in Wasps, and you're heavily involved in the Perth club hockey scene. But it is difficult in that players from other clubs effectively come over and take the positions of people who like juniors in those clubs, and also there's always got to be a spot open for them. And on the flip side, there's no, I guess people often talk about the financial incentive to play for the Perth club, and I know there's a school of thought where some people don't necessarily attach themselves to the club in Perth because they're never there, and it's a very, very interesting scenario. And I've probably made a complete mess of that trying to describe the club system in Perth, but I was wondering if you could shed some light on that situation and your take on it, perhaps in a much more articulate manner than I just did, because you're the journalist.
I don't know if I can do that. But yeah, it's interesting because the point you make is very true. There are some players who sort of want that financial support when they're playing for their club, and go, if I'm going to give up the time to go to training with you guys as well and then play at the weekend on top of what I'm doing with the Australian setup, then I want reimbursement, especially because, and let's be fair, most of you live fairly close to the hockey stadium so that you can get to training at 6 a.m. and don't have to get out of bed at 4 a.m. to drive there. So some of the clubs are a little bit further away, and so suddenly getting there is a bit of a task, especially for training, if depending on the distance that's travelled. The other interesting thing that, speaking to a lot of players, have said that what they would like is the Hockey Australia program to allow them to play more games for their clubs locally. That they feel that would be a bit of a release. It would give them a chance where, and it was Trent Mitten who actually said to me how, he goes, at training all week trying to get past Matthew Swan is tiring. He goes, whereas you think at the weekend, he goes, it would be quite nice to where you'd have a little bit more space and you could try some of the things that you've been coached by, Colin Batch and Anthony Potter and Rob Hammond during the week to then actually put them into practice in a match at the weekend. And I think there's a lot, in my view, and I look at my own youth when I was growing up, was, we had minor counties players were playing for the club and you aspired to be like those. So even as a junior, I think you wanted to be like that. And you also would stay and watch them because certainly if you had any ambition, you wanted to see what they did. If they played in your position or whatever, you looked at how they did things so that you might be able to learn something. So I think, in my opinion, having players like yourselves or involved with the Australian program playing more games for the club, I think it would benefit the club system. And I think it would benefit the juniors coming through because they've suddenly got more role models. They get to see you closer. And I think it would in turn then help when you play an international here because those same people will have a stronger connection with you and will then want to go down and watch you playing and representing their club when you play for Australia.
That's a very interesting point. We could talk a lot about that, I imagine. Obviously, there's clubs on the East Coast that need to be considered as well. And as we said, it's difficult in that Australia is so big. How can you balance them both? It's not that easy. Certainly, the Hockey One is a step in the right direction, I imagine. Now, I'm going to briefly interrupt here to introduce a feature of the show. We'll call it our Hero of Hockey segment. We know that community sport flourishes on the back of hard-working volunteers who give up their time and effort simply for the love of it. And we want to give you, the listener, the opportunity to contact us and tell us who deserves to be our Hero of Hockey for the week. Tell us who they are, what club they're from, and what they've done for the sport, and we'll give them and your club a shout out. So, get in touch via our socials, and your nominee could be chosen for the next episode. This week, we at the Help Side would like to add our voice to the chorus of those saying thank you to the 6 wonderful people who are this week awarded Hockey Australia Life Membership. Life Membership can be considered the highest off-field honour that can be awarded, and its bestowal signifies a lifetime of voluntary commitment and service to hockey. So, a big congratulations and a very warm thank you to Sue Briggs, Bob Claxton, Lynn Hill, Carol Sheridan, Robert Taylor, and Colin Wansborough. You're all legends, and we appreciate all you do. Now it's back to Ashley, who's about to share with us his thoughts on the state of our game from a local level right up to how we're comparing internationally. But I want to talk about hockey in Australia in general. You're in a good position to see that and see if we're tracking in the right direction. Actually, we're going to start by going more broadly. Let's go international. There's been the induction of the FIH Pro League. You've been in hockey for a long time. You've commentated a lot of internationals. Do you think hockey is heading in the right direction?
At the moment, the finances say it probably isn't. I think there's a lot of issues personally. I think that this as well, this COVID-19, I think, we're going to come out and it's going to be a very different landscape. And I therefore think we need to have the right people sitting around a table looking at how we're going to come out of this and how we're going to make the sport not only grow, but have a strong foundation. I think the key thing we need to make sure as a sport is hockey needs to cement that foundation and make it so strong. And we heard the FIH Congress say that they were going to put in place a rigid calendar. Well, what's happened to that international calendar? I mean, it's a shambles, in my opinion. Even for me as a commentator trying to plan, you go, well, nothing's in the same place. And I think they've really messed it up. So to me, you need to get all of the national competitions need to put in their dates. You then need to have, and I would actually do away with the confederations, but that's a story for another day, because I think it's a tier of management that we don't actually need. But I think then you need to look at the regions and say, well, okay, when are your tournaments? So when is the Sultan Azlan Shah Cup? When do you want the Pan American Cup? All of these, so that again, you fill all of those in, and then and to me, this is it. You then build your international tournaments around those, because those are the core competitions that are then feeding up to the international. And I don't think it should be done the other way around. I think, we're putting international tournaments and then saying to all of the various national associations, you've got to fit in with us. And to me, we're doing it the wrong way around, because players come up through those national associations to play internationally, and therefore the international program should be fitting around those. Now, there's going to have to be a little bit of give and take with both, but I do think that that's something that needs to be really looked at carefully, because I think the Pro League it's a great tournament. I mean, the hockey has been great. This year, I think there were too many teams were looking at the Olympics and were playing structures that they were just trying things or trying combinations. So the level of play that we saw last year, to me, was a little bit below that. I don't know if it's feasible, to be honest. I think trying to have this global tournament and all the travel that there is, and the fact you've changed it the second year, the format of the competition, not a good sign. I would actually quite like to see, for example, a Pro League, yes, but you have the Europeans play, maybe the whole of the Americas play. So, you get your Chile, you get your Argentina, your Uruguay, and all of those countries playing with America, and then the Europeans play, and then Asia plays, and let's throw Oceania into Asia as well. And then you could say the top 4 teams from each of those pools, or if Europe really feel that, they've got the best teams, then they can maybe have an extra spot or whatever. And then you come together for one tournament in one place, and that could be rotated to find out who is the best team in the world. Because I do think it's a little bit exclusive at the moment, the way we've got just the top 9 and we're forgetting about the rest. And just as I'm saying that, to me, for hockey to really survive, we've got to pull the standard of those teams outside of the top 10 up.
Yeah.
So that the games that you have are harder when you play against those. And if you look at football's done that really well in the last 20 years. And I actually pulled this up. I'm just going to give you an example. So you've got in the world rankings for FIFA, Senegal are 20 at the moment, Peru 21, Chile are at 19. You've got Germany sitting at 15, the Netherlands at 14, and Italy at 13. So that tells you there are 3 really strong football nations. I mean, Germany and Italy, apart from Brazil, have won more World Cups than anybody else, and yet they're not in the top 10 anymore. So what that shows you is that the rest of the world have caught up with them. And I think we're forming too much of an exclusive band at the top and not giving those other nations the chance to come up.
Sure. I mean, there's a few points on that. Formerly there was it wasn't the Pro League, it was the World League, I guess, and Hockey World League. It was a tiered system. It seems like that was kind of what you were saying. It was you had to qualify through the first few levels, and if you did, then you could play with the quote unquote, big guns in the top 10.
Yeah.
Is that something similar? They obviously did away with that in favor of this Pro League, which was about bringing the top teams against each other more, which from our perspective is a great thing because, I mean, we've played Belgium, Germany, Holland more times in the last year than we would have had in the previous 4, I guess. So that's good. But I do understand. I like what you're saying about bringing that bottom level up. However, one point would be in the Oceania Cup, for example, like some games we play Samoa, we play Fiji, Vanuatu, PNG, these sorts of things, and it's like 30-0 sort of thing. So is the difference too great to really have that same level as what's been achieved with football?
I think when you look at that, yes, you have the same problem when you look at, with the exception of rugby union, pretty much most sports with Oceania. And I think what we need to do is that if Oceania is genuinely going to try and come up in the sport, then you've got to throw a lot of money at it. I don't think any sport, be it football or hockey, are prepared to do that. So to me, the only thing you would do is they would have, say, a playoff tournament and their top team would come through. Or they may choose to do, as we've seen with Iran in the indoor situation, where Iran was going, we're going to struggle in 11-a-side. Then why don't we focus on getting the indoor side of things right? And to me, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a legitimate part of the game. And Iran have done a fantastic job and are now, a shining light for a lot of other nations, that if you can't get up there with your 11-a-side, and you're not going to be able to put teams in place. But the other thing that I see linked to that is that, and we could go on forever, as you said.
Yeah.
I think the turf pitches is a big problem because that's holding the game back. So I would actually like to see the sport look at saying, okay, we're going to have some tournaments on grass now. Allow some of these nations, if they don't have a turf pitch, by all means, have tournaments on grass. And, even Australia could put a team in on grass and see how they go against some of these nations. And I think that would be quite an interesting dynamic. I'd sort of leave your 5s, I think, because, again, it's a new format, it's a new cost. And I don't think the sport can afford it at the moment. I think we need to consolidate what we've got and use what we currently have. So there's turf pitches. But again, if you're going to put a turf pitch into, say, Guatemala, they got one a few years ago, I believe. Now, you've got to put in place a competition. So it's pointless having a pitch if you don't have a league and people using it.
True.
So if you look at what David Sweetman did, the CEO of Scottish Hockey, and I take my hat off to him. I mean, he was really smart and said, he had to grow the game in Scotland in order to get more funding to be able to sort of help the game along. And he said, we had coaches because we'd qualified coaches and we'd done coaching courses, but we didn't have enough clubs. So he went out, spoke to people who wanted to set up a club, and then help them put the infrastructure in place so that they would have more clubs. And so I think that's something that I would like to see, say, Hockey Australia, FIH, or various national associations do, is help put in place, help create clubs, and then help create league competition. So that then those competitions will, as I said before, feed into a national team. And suddenly your talent pool will have grown and you will be able to start developing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think with hockey, obviously the battle we're constantly fighting is one of resources. I mean, hockey is not something where, if you have a stick and a ball, you can play anywhere, but it's not the same in soccer in that you can just spring up a hockey pitch in a dust bowl. It's, in order to play club hockey, you really do need the infrastructure. So that's a very interesting point. I just want to go back to that resources piece and what you mentioned about Pro League and that it's not feasible. If FIH and all the clubs were, the international federations were, if they were resource rich, if they had unlimited resources, do you think that the Pro League is a feasible competition? I mean, the one-off games versus typically hockey's been a tournament-based thing where, we play 8 games in a couple of weeks. Do you think the one-off matches is the way forward?
Look, I liked it last year. I thought it was really good. When it was all in discussion and we were talking about that, my view was to actually, if teams were coming all that way, it seemed a heck of a long way to go to play one game. And my thought at the time was that they should play 3 games. And the idea being that, say, for example, if, you're playing Belgium, Belgium win the first game, you win the second, and then obviously there's a bonus point for who wins the rubber. So, and then if, for example, you've won the first 2 games, well, you've won the rubber there. But then what you could do to make the last game interesting again is if you clean sweep a team, you get 2 bonus points on the league table. So to me, that just made it more reasonable for you guys to travel, to actually have more than one game. And when I did actually sit down with somebody and we worked out how you could actually do that, for example, if you went to Europe, so you could play sort of Great Britain over 3 days and then head over and have sort of a couple of days rest, and then you could play 3 games, say, against Belgium or Germany or whatever. And we sat down and we worked out that it could be done. It would take a bit of work to work out the scheduling, but it could have been done. So that was one of the things I think. But the bit that I worry about most of all is, I think we know that this year with the TV, they did it remotely from Sweden with the broadcasting. I don't think that worked. And I've had arguments with various TV stations that I work for who are all heading towards this remote commentary thing. Hockey is too fast, in my opinion. And one of those TV directors actually emailed me as soon as it started and said, "You're absolutely right, it doesn't work." I still hold that view, and that's not because I wasn't involved in it. I just think that it's too fast a game and there's too much movement out of shot for you to be able to be doing it remotely in it, because you can't see what's going on outside of your screen. The other thing that I think the Pro League needs desperately, and if you look at why, and in my opinion, the Hockey India League in the end fell over, it wasn't marketed. And if you don't spend money on marketing this, promoting it, and there's too much reliance on the TV stations and the broadcasters, they're going, well, they've bought the rights, they'll promote it. Yeah, they'll promote it, but they're not going to spend the money to get people through the gates to promote it. And I think the one thing the sport fails, in my opinion, is the best asset it has are the players and the coaches and the people involved in it. I've covered, cricket, football, rugby. The hockey players worldwide are the nicest people I've ever, in any sport I've ever had to deal with. And I do not think we utilize those people well enough to promote the game. And I think if we did, you would see a real change and a real turnaround, because most hockey players are articulate. They also are incredibly modest. They're dedicated. They've got all of the attributes that if I had children, I would want them to have.
Is there a recipe for that, do you think?
I think it could be done. I think, you need to obviously, the issue you then come into is player image rights, etc. And whether you guys, had managers or whatever, then it could get complicated. But if it was set up properly where, there was, say, a profit share for the players and you had a players union, then I think, yes, it's very much doable. And I think talking to most of the players, you want the game to grow. You want to see it succeed. And most of the players I speak to want to do that. So I think, yes, I think most of the players would be on board if them giving up some of their time to promote the sport and make it more appealing. I think most of them would do it.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very interesting point. So somewhat, I guess, leveraging the players and using them as a resource. They're an underutilized resource. That's the gist?
Yeah. And I think there's sometimes, I think, sadly, we do things the way other sports have done it. And some of the content that is put out is a bit dull. And I just think there's so much more that could be done with a little bit of imagination. And if you look at, and I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure, I know Jaap Stockman works in the digital, the former Dutch goalkeeper. I think Maurits First and Florian Fuchs both work in marketing. So you've got players that have been involved at the highest level who are involved in that marketing space. And again, it's like, why not get them involved? Why not use that expertise from the guys who've been there?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I want to stay on the topic of the game, and let's talk about production now. You spoke about the game is too fast, and I definitely agree. I think the thing about hockey is that often the best opportunities come straight after one team has had an opportunity. Like the amount of times that we're watching code, we've got the TV footage, and we want to see what's happening, in this counter-attack opportunity, which almost certainly will have come off a missed opportunity at the other end. What does it take to do the production well? I mean, how do you do that? How do you stop missing footage?
Yeah, I mean, it's, to be honest, again, in my opinion, you have to have directors that know the sport or producers that know the sport. And when the sport has had that, and I've worked with people, they don't make those mistakes and they don't miss goals, or they know when to put the replays in. And I've worked with some really, really good people, and I've worked with some people who don't know the sport, and I've worked with one person who didn't give a damn about the sport. And I actually had a bit of a row with them after one particular tournament, because they just didn't care. They were there for the money, and that was it. And it showed in the production, in my opinion, that they just, I mean, I think they missed 3 goals in the tournament. So that sort of says what they were like.
Yeah.
But I think again, it comes down to me, you've got to, again, the FIH or whoever's in charge have got to make a decision. This is the best director. And if you look, cricket, for example, fly the best directors to test matches around the world. The same guys are doing, they're going all around the world doing it. So we had, for example, Indian directors came down and they did the Cricket World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. So if you're doing that with cricket, hockey, if it wants to put out the best product, has to invest in that and making sure that they get the best directors doing that work.
Yeah. I mean, to tie back to your other point about utilizing the players more, it's not often we get consulted. And I mean, we probably watch more games than anyone. And I've never been consulted about whether it's produced well or not well or anything like that. And I'm not sure if any players have. If they have, then let us know. But that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of the coaches have said, that they get frustrated because hockey is pretty much filmed the same way as you would film a football match, soccer match. And they're going, they would like to see more camera work from behind the goal. And the Champions Trophy in China, the women's, I know that Astro Arena in Malaysia were looking to do that, but then the wrong camera turned up at the venue, so they couldn't actually do it. But that shows you, I mean, John Nienaber, who's an Australian who's in charge of Astro Arena, he is very much aware and will sit and talk to the hockey people and say, well, what do you want? How can we improve it? What can we do? I mean, and they've had, they put a camera in the goal, crossbar of the goal, and won Sultan Aslan Shah, which was fantastic. They were actually the first people to have umpire camera. The players at the time, the umpires at the time, it was too heavy. But I thought that was actually really good because it showed you then the angle that the umpire saw the offence or could not see it because number 3 was in his way or whatever. You also saw the pressure that an umpire was put on with players running towards him going, short corner, or, referral. I really like that innovation. I mean, one of the things I think, and I had this conversation with several people, I think the women's game could be actually filmed differently. Now, this might sound really crazy, but it is a little bit slower than the men's game. So I think you could actually spend more time getting closer to the action to see some of the skills than you necessarily can do in the men's game. And I just think that if you had a director that knew what he was doing, you could possibly look at filming it differently or just doing it. But everyone says, but that's too hard. But I think, it could really lift the level of the exposure of the women's game if just a little bit of time was spent on that, because I think you've got the time to film it differently.
Yeah. No, I think with hockey in general, I mean, the athletes are primarily fans first, and I think there is a little bit of disappointment in I guess the recordings in general. I think where we want people to come out and watch us play, because we know that it comes across so much better live than what it does, and that's definitely a space for work there. I want to talk about Aslan Shah. I mean, anyone who's heard Aslan Shah has definitely heard your voice. You're definitely the voice of Aslan Shah. It's a fantastic tournament held in Malaysia. I want to know, what is it? So you obviously like going because you're there every single year. What is it about Malaysia and Aslan Shah that keeps bringing you back?
Because they keep asking me. If they keep asking me, I wouldn't be there. No, look, I was very lucky, and I think it's a great tournament. I like it very much because, it's got the history behind it. It's been going for over 25 years or 25 tournaments. It was biennial. And I just think that the teams now and the standards gone up. I mean, there was a time where a few teams were sending development teams there and, looking to just blood players. And you're still seeing that. I mean, I think you made your debut there, didn't you?
It was one of my earlier tournaments, yeah. But Daniel Beale, a lot of us have debuted there.
Hockey and then that, didn't you?
No, that was Ben actually. So Ben. Anyway, it was I debuted a Perth game. But Aslan Shah is often used as a debut tournament. Yeah, you're right.
So a lot of younger players are given that chance, 3 or 4 of them at a time. So again, it's a good tournament for the coaches to see whether you guys are up to it or not. And it's also a good time to give you game time, because again, if you talk to a lot of the players, they say you don't feel you belong until you've played sort of 20 to 30 international games. You suddenly then realise, actually, I can play at this level. So look, I just think it's a good atmosphere. It's a great venue. The crowds turn out in their numbers. The Storms we could do without some years. Apart from that, it's just a great tournament with a lot of history, and the Malaysians love it.
Yeah, for sure. On that, do you have a favourite commentating location?
Oh, no, I don't think I do, to be honest. I'm happy to do it anywhere, and I've done it in some pretty strange places over the years. I think one of the strangest was in the Solomon Islands. I did the Socceroos versus the Solomon Islands in 2001, and we were told we had to get to the stadium about 3 hours before the game, and the hotel was only like half a K away. And we were like, why? And then when we got down there, you realised that it must be nearly everyone in the Solomon Islands was there. Every tree was full. There was a hill opposite the ground, completely packed. Couldn't see a blade of grass. And I was literally on top of this tin stand with a plastic table, plastic chair, and an umbrella. And that was it. And it was just a really memorable moment. But it was brilliant.
That's fantastic. Do you have a favourite game you've ever broadcasted? I mean, you've gone to some amazing places and you've watched a lot of games. Is there one that stands out in particular?
It's funny because you said you were going to ask me this, so I actually got my thinking cap on a little bit. I think I actually got it down to 3 games, to be honest. And one actually involved your brother Ben in that he was captain of the under-21s at the Sultan of Johor Cup. But it didn't actually involve him in the game because it was the final in 2014, India versus Great Britain. And India won with 45 seconds on the clock. Harmanpreet swept home a penalty corner. But that was just a really good game because both teams, although they neither wanted to lose, they were so desperate they weren't going to make mistakes, but it was still a very attacking game. And I just thought it was a sensational advert for the game. I think one of my other games would have been the Hockey India League final in 2015, Ranchi Rays versus JP Punjab Warriors, where JP Punjab Warriors, took the lead. Kieran Govers scored first for them, and then Stanley Mins got a goal, I think, for Ranchi. And then Chris Sorello, the big dog, stepped up, took the lead again for JP Punjab Warriors. But within a minute, just as you were saying there, Barry Middleton came back and got an equaliser for Ranchi, and then it went to a shootout, and Tyler Lovell was the hero for Ranchi, and they won the title. And the other one that was fantastic was the Hockey World League, which we just talked about, the bronze medal match between India and the Netherlands. That was in 2015 in Raipur. And again, it was an incredible game because it was 2-1 at the end of the third quarter and finished 5-5. And it was just goals galore. And I was working with Cedric D'Souza, the former Indian coach, and I thought he was going to have a heart attack. India got the last 2 goals to force a shootout. And then, of course, Rupinder Pal won it for them in the shootout.
Yeah, incredible.
So those would be probably 3 standout games for me that I really, really enjoyed. In fact, 2 of them I actually asked for copies of after we'd done them. So
brilliant. So many games like that in our sport. I have a question about HIL, just because I'm always asked this. Is HIL coming back?
I don't know. I mean, I would really like it to come back. There was talk that they were going to bring it back as a 5s tournament. And I believe that the franchises, because I think the model they were looking at was it was going to be 5s men, 5s women. And the franchise owners were going, well, that's the same as if we played 11 aside, we're going to need the same amount of people. And I believe that one of the issues as well was the TV stations. I know the Star Sports were not interested in the 5-a-side game, or that's what I've been told anyway by somebody in the organisation. So, look, I would love it to come back. I thought it was a really good tournament, and I think it actually helped Indian hockey incredibly. And I think, again, there was more that could have been done with that in terms of, you have players from all around the world playing, and people used to contact me saying, oh, I want a Ranchi Rays shirt. How can I get one? Yeah. And they were in London, or they might have been, in Australia. And I think there were things that could have been done, especially when you think, Hockey Australia had that memorandum of understanding. They could have sold rather on their website shirts from the various franchises to fans in Australia with Kieran Gubber's name on, with Tyler Lovell's name, or Simon Orchard, Rob Hammond, whoever, And there's another revenue stream, but at the same time, it's promoting the league. And I just think there were missed opportunities there.
Yeah, no, it was an awesome experience, and I think everyone wants it to come back. But as to whether it will remains to be seen. I usually finish the podcast with a couple of quick questions. Now, I haven't interviewed a journalist before or a commentator, so this is a journalist edition, and accordingly, they're probably going to be a little bit longer. We'll start you off with an easy one, though. The best player. This can be an individual performance or whatever, but the best player you've seen.
In hockey?
In hockey.
Look, it's very hard because who's the best player? I mean, you can have players that do a lot of work, but they may not be the flashiest or do the skills. I think Mark Knowles as a leader, I was really impressed with his leadership. I just thought he had a presence. He kept pretty calm. He was very clever with the umpires in that when the opposition used to have a referral, he would walk across and you could hear it on the microphone. He'd go, while you're looking at that, can you look at this? So I think his leadership was fantastic because he obviously put it in the umpire's mind that there might have been something else. You can't go past Turn de Nooijer and Jamie Dwyer, obviously. They were phenomenal players, and you don't win the accolades that they have without that. I've always liked. I grew up, and one of the hockey coaches we mentioned at the beginning, who sort of made me fall in love with the game, was a Pakistani, and so I always have enjoyed the stick skills and just the flair with which the Indians and the Pakistanis play. And Shakil Abbasi was one that I just loved every moment he was on the ball, just because of what he could do with a stick. But then if you look, again, we were talking before we started this, Agustin Mazzilli. Again, his close skills are phenomenal. And again, he's one of those players that when he gets the ball, you're on the edge of your seat. So I don't think there's any one, but there are some that I just admire what they can do. Good
answer. Last question. This is a toughie. We've spoken a lot. Well, we've spoken at length about what needs to happen within the game, but there's a big, wide world out there of people who don't know about hockey, who don't watch hockey, who we think in our sport would fall in love with hockey if they watched it. But what do you think is needed in our game in order to expand the audience?
Look, something I feel very strongly. There's a book I've got here that was written in, I think, 1965. And there was the Australian, and I'm trying to think of his, I think it was Colin Emer, who was an umpire anyway, and he said the biggest problem with the sport, this is in the 60s, is the rules are too complicated and we don't market our sport. Well, we've touched on the marketing. To me, and I've spoken to the last 3 CEOs of the FIH and said, this is my personal view. And as a commentator and talking to people, I think we need to sit down as rugby union did. Rugby union went to Stellenbosch and they got past players, current players, coaches, past coaches, TV people in a room, and they went through the rule book, rule by rule. And the idea was, how can we make it simpler? Now, I'm not saying that rugby's necessarily succeeded, because there are still some of the rules that you just go, what? I mean, the front row rule, nobody really knows who's at fault there. But anyway, that's another story. But I think hockey could do that. I think there are certainly, when you sit after a tournament or in the bar at the end of a day's play and you talk to coaches, a lot of them have got great ideas for making some of the rules or the interpretation of the rules clearer for the fans. And I think we've got too many rules that are left to interpretation for the umpires, which I think is unfair on umpires, especially, and let's bear this in mind, these umpires are amateurs. They are not being paid. All they get is a per diem. I would like to see umpires, a panel of professional umpires that are literally the best, say 12 or 15, male or female, that travel the world doing the top games. That's something I think needs to happen. But I would like to see the umpires involved, players, ex-players, and broadcasters to sit and go through the rule book and go, do we really need this? What are we trying to say here? Can we get rid of it? Or can we make it simpler? And I think that until we do that, the game's always going to struggle.
It's a very interesting point. And I have to ask, are there any rules that immediately spring to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overhead is one, and the danger when it comes down. And, you know, Terry Walsh has got I think it's actually, I've thought about it a lot. And he says, you know, look, if it is deemed that there is danger where the ball comes down, then the free hit goes back to where the pass was thrown. So what it means is that the people throwing the pass from deep in their defence are probably going to think twice if they're, you know, losing a game or they're under pressure, that suddenly that free hit could come back down into their half. And I think that would eliminate the danger straight away, or it would make people more responsible before throwing those passes.
Interesting. That's about all we're going to cover today, Ashley. As I said, I could talk a lot more in depth about all these sorts of things, but maybe that's for over a beer another time. Thank you very much for joining me. I very, very much appreciate it. And your views are very welcome in my book always.
Well, thanks very much for your time. I hope I haven't upset too many people with my comments, but always up for a beer anyway.
Not at all. Beautiful. Thanks, Ashley. Big thank you to the production team of David Moore, Tim Collier, and Jimmy Stevens. If you do like The Help Side, please like, subscribe, interact. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us at The Help Side on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That's it for now. We'll catch you on The Help Side next time.